The gunshot tore through the peaceful dawn air, sending a flock of startled birds rushing skyward from the cottonwoods along the creek. Nora Jenkins froze on the wooden porch of her father's general store, her hands still gripping the broom she'd been using to sweep away the night's dust. The sound had come from down the main street of Bonanza, Colorado, where a cloud of disturbed dirt now hung in the early morning light. It was the spring of 1878, and the mining town had seen its share of trouble, but gunfire at daybreak was never a good sign. Nora, 22 and fiercely independent despite her father's protective nature, set her broom against the wall and stepped to the edge of the porch for a better view. 3 riders on horseback were thundering toward the store, bandanas pulled up over their faces, guns drawn. Behind them, a man lay sprawled in the dirt of the main street. Sheriff Carson, she realized with a jolt of horror. The lawman wasn't moving. "Pa," Nora called over her shoulder, her voice tight with fear. "Pa, come quick." The door of Jenkins' general store swung open as Thomas Jenkins emerged, wiping his hands on his apron. "What in tarnation?" His words died as he spotted the approaching riders. "Nora, get inside. Now." He reached for her arm, but it was too late. The lead rider, a hulking man with cold eyes visible above his bandana, reined his horse to a stop in front of the store. Well, if it ain't the prettiest shopkeep in Colorado territory. "We don't want any trouble," Thomas said firmly, stepping in front of his daughter. "Take what you need and be on your way." The second rider laughed, a harsh sound that sent a chill down Nora's spine. "Oh, we'll take what we need all right." He gestured with his revolver. "Starting with your cash box and whatever else catches our eye." The third outlaw, smaller than the others but with a dangerous gleam in his eyes, dismounted and approached the porch. "Boss said to make it quick. The sheriff's already raised the alarm." "The sheriff won't be raising anything for a good long while," the lead outlaw replied, his gaze never leaving Nora. "And I reckon we can take our time." What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. The third outlaw pushed past Thomas and entered the store. The second kept his gun trained on them from horseback. And the leader, with a movement so swift Nora barely registered it, reached down, grabbed her arm and hauled her up onto his horse. "No." Thomas lunged forward, but the second outlaw's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him back against the storefront. "Pa," Nora screamed, struggling against the iron grip that held her. "Let me go." The leader's arm tightened around her waist. "You're worth more than anything in that store, Miss Jenkins. Your pa's the richest man in this valley, and I reckon he'll pay handsomely to get you back." The third outlaw emerged from the store, stuffing bills and coins into his saddlebags. "Got what I could. We best ride." "Tell your pa we'll be in touch," the leader called to Thomas, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder. $20,000 ought to cover the price of your return. He's got 3 days. With that, he spurred his horse forward, keeping Nora firmly in his grasp as they galloped away from the store, out of town, and toward the rugged mountains that formed the western boundary of the valley. Nora fought with every ounce of strength she possessed, but the outlaw's grip was unyielding. Her last glimpse of Bonanza was of her father staggering to his feet, his face a mask of anguish and fury as he watched his only daughter vanish into the distance. Miles away, on the eastern edge of town, Flynn Dawson awoke to the sound of urgent knocking on his cabin door. The 27-year-old former Army scout rolled from his bunk, grabbed his revolver from the bedside table, and approached the door with caution. Few people came calling at his remote cabin, especially at this hour. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rough with sleep. "It's Deputy Miller, Dawson. Open up. There's trouble." Flynn unbolted the door to find the young deputy standing on his porch, his horse heaving for breath behind him. Sheriff Carson's been shot. Miss Jenkins has been taken. Her pa's offering a reward for her safe return." Flynn's blood ran cold. He knew Nora Jenkins. Everyone in Bonanza knew her, the spirited daughter of the town's most successful businessman, with her copper-colored hair and quick smile. They'd spoken only a few times, brief exchanges at the store or passing on the street, but there was something about her that had always caught his attention. "Taken by who?" Flynn demanded, already moving back into the cabin to dress. "Dalton gang, we think. 3 of them. They shot the sheriff when he tried to stop them robbing the bank. Then they went to Jenkins' store, wounded Thomas, and took Nora. Said they want $20,000 in 3 days. Flynn pulled on his boots and reached for his hat. "The sheriff. Doc's with him now. Says it's bad, but he might pull through." Miller shifted nervously. "Mr. Jenkins is asking for you specifically. Says he'll pay $5,000 to anyone who brings his daughter back safe, but he wants you to try first. Says you're the best tracker in the territory." Flynn grabbed his rifle from the wall rack and checked that it was loaded. "I don't need his money. Tell him I'll bring her back." Within 20 minutes, Flynn had saddled his horse, a sturdy Mustang named Copper, and packed supplies for what might be a lengthy pursuit. As a former scout for the Army, he knew the terrain between Bonanza and the New Mexico territory better than almost anyone. If the Dalton gang was heading south, as he suspected they would be, he had a chance of cutting them off before they reached the border. Before riding out, Flynn made a stop at the general store. Thomas Jenkins was sitting in a chair while Doc Wilson finished bandaging his shoulder. "Dawson," Thomas acknowledged, his face pale with pain and worry. "They took my girl." "I know," Flynn replied quietly. "I'll get her back." "I meant what I said about the reward." Flynn cut him off with a shake of his head. "Keep your money. Just tell me everything you can remember about these men." Thomas described the outlaws in detail, from their horses to their weapons to the few words they'd spoken. Flynn listened intently, building a mental picture of his quarry. "The leader," Thomas finished. "He knew Nora by name. Knew she was my daughter. This wasn't random. They came for her specifically." Flynn nodded grimly. "That means they've been watching the town, planning this." He studied the map spread out on the counter. "If they're smart, they'll avoid the main trails. They'll head for the Badlands, then cut south toward Rattlesnake Canyon." "That's Apache territory," Doc Wilson warned. "It is," Flynn agreed. "But it's also the quickest route to the border if you know the paths." He folded the map and tucked it into his saddlebag. "I'll follow their trail as far as I can today, then cut across to intercept them." Thomas grasped Flynn's arm with surprising strength. "Bring her back, Dawson. Bring my Nora back to me." "I will," Flynn promised, and he meant it. He'd been drifting since leaving the Army 2 years ago, taking odd jobs and keeping to himself. But now, with Nora Jenkins in danger, he felt a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced in a long time. As he mounted Copper and rode out of town, following the clear tracks of the outlaws' horses, Flynn knew this wasn't just about a reward, or doing a good turn for a neighbor. There was something about Nora Jenkins that had always drawn his eye: her fierce independence, her kindness to everyone in town, regardless of their station, the quiet strength she displayed helping her father run the store after her mother's death 3 years ago. He'd never acted on his interest, believing a woman like her, educated, refined, from a good family, would have little use for a solitary man with nothing to his name but a horse, a rifle, and the skills he'd learned in a decade of hard living. But now, with her life in danger, none of that mattered. He would find her. He would bring her home. Everything else would sort itself out later. The trail led west initially into the foothills, before turning south as Flynn had predicted. The outlaws were moving fast but not covering their tracks. Either they were confident no one would follow, or they wanted to be followed on their terms. Either way, it made his job easier for the moment. By midday, he'd reached a stream where they'd stopped to water their horses. The signs told him they were perhaps 3 hours ahead of him. If he pushed hard, he might catch sight of them before nightfall, but that would risk alerting them to his presence. Better to maintain a steady pace and close the gap gradually. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Flynn found himself riding along a narrow ridge overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness. In the distance, he could just make out 3 riders moving along the edge of a dry creek bed. He pulled Copper to a halt and raised his spyglass. There they were, 3 men, just as described, and with them a 4th figure on horseback. Nora. Even from this distance, he could see she was sitting upright on her own horse now, her hands presumably bound to the saddle horn. She was alive, and that knowledge sent a surge of relief through him. Flynn calculated distances and terrain in his head. They were heading for Rattlesnake Canyon, as he'd guessed. If he continued following directly, they'd reach the canyon by midday tomorrow. But if he rode through the night, taking the old Indian trail that cut through the eastern hills, he could be waiting for them when they arrived. With one last look at the distant figures, Flynn turned Copper east. He would need to push hard, but he'd have the element of surprise. And in a fight against 3 armed outlaws, surprise might be the only advantage he'd have. Nora Jenkins had never known such fear, nor such fury. The outlaw leader, a man the others called Vance, had kept her secured in front of him on his horse for the first few hours of their flight from Bonanza. Her wrists were bound with rough rope, and every attempt to speak had been met with a harsh command for silence. As the day wore on, they'd stopped briefly at a stream. Vance had finally allowed her to ride her own horse, though her hands remained tied to the saddle horn, and a lead rope connected her mount to his. The brief respite from his oppressive presence was little comfort given her circumstances. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded when they stopped again in the late afternoon. "My father will contact the law. There will be posses searching every trail." Vance had laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Your father will do exactly as he's told if he wants to see you alive again. As for posses, we'll be long gone before they organize themselves. By this time tomorrow, we'll be in territory where no Bonanza lawman will follow. And if my father cannot raise so much money in 3 days," a cold smile had spread across Vance's face, "let's hope it doesn't come to that. I'd hate to have to send him pieces of his precious daughter to motivate faster payment." Now, as dusk approached and they made camp in a sheltered hollow, Nora assessed her situation with as much clarity as her fear would allow. 3 men against 1 woman, the odds were not in her favor for a direct escape attempt. Her hands were still bound, though they'd removed her from the horse and secured her to a small tree at the edge of their camp. The youngest outlaw, a jittery man called Jem, was tending the horses. The second man, a broad-shouldered brute named Mac, was gathering wood for a small fire. Vance was studying a map, occasionally glancing in her direction with a look that made her skin crawl. "We should have taken more time in that store," Mac grumbled. "Could have cleaned out the whole place." "The money wasn't the point," Vance replied. "The girl's our ticket. 20,000 is more than we'd get robbing a dozen general stores." "If her pa pays," Jem said nervously. "What if he don't have that kind of money?" "He has it," Vance said with certainty. "Jenkins is the richest man in 3 counties. He owns half the mining claims in the valley, plus the store, plus investments back east. He'll pay." "And after he pays?" Mac asked, his gaze sliding toward Nora with an expression that turned her blood to ice. "What then?" Vance's answer was interrupted by the distant howl of a wolf. He frowned, scanning the darkening horizon. No fire tonight. We're still too close to town. Jem, take first watch. Mac, secure the girl properly. I don't want her trying anything foolish in the night. Nora watched them warily as Mac approached with a length of rope. Please, she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. The ropes are already too tight. I'm losing feeling in my hands. Mac hesitated, glancing back at Vance, who gave a short nod. Loosen them a bit. We need her healthy for the exchange, but make sure she's secure. As Mac adjusted her bindings, Nora forced herself to remain calm. She needed her wits about her. Someone would be coming for her. Her father would see to that. All she needed to do was stay alive and alert until help arrived. Or until she could escape on her own. Flynn traveled through the night, allowing Copper only brief rests as they followed the little-used trail through the eastern hills. The path was treacherous in the darkness, but the full moon provided enough light to navigate by, and Flynn's years as a scout had taught him to read terrain even in poor visibility. By dawn, he had reached the northern entrance to Rattlesnake Canyon. The narrow passage wound between towering red rock walls, opening occasionally into wider basins before constricting again. It was the perfect place for an ambush, which was precisely why Flynn needed to choose his position carefully. He found what he was looking for about 2 miles into the canyon, a natural shelf of rock that overlooked a section where the path narrowed to barely the width of 2 horses side by side. Anyone passing below would be exposed, with steep walls preventing easy escape. After securing Copper in a hidden gully with access to water, Flynn made his way to the shelf and settled in to wait. He laid his rifle across a flat rock, checked his revolvers, and prepared a second position 20 yards away in case he needed to move quickly. Then he pulled out his spyglass and trained it on the northern approach to the canyon. They wouldn't arrive for hours yet, if his calculations were correct. Flynn forced himself to eat some jerky and hardtack from his provisions, knowing he needed to keep up his strength. As he chewed the tough meat, his mind drifted to Nora Jenkins. He remembered the first time he'd really noticed her, about 6 months after he'd settled in Bonanza. He'd come to the general store to purchase supplies, and she'd been helping a young Mexican woman who spoke little English. Instead of growing impatient like many would have, Nora had used what Spanish words she knew, along with gestures and smiles, to understand what the woman needed. When the woman had come up short on money, Nora had quietly made up the difference from her own purse, waving away thanks with a genuine smile. It was a small act of kindness, the sort most people wouldn't even register, but it had stuck with Flynn. In a frontier town where survival often bred selfishness, Nora Jenkins had shown compassion without hesitation or expectation of reward. After that, he'd found himself noticing her more and more. The way she always had a kind word for the children who came into the store. How she stood up to the mine foreman when he tried to cheat some of the workers out of their pay. The quiet dignity with which she handled the loss of her mother to fever 3 years earlier. Flynn had considered asking to call on her properly more than once, but always found a reason not to. What would a woman like her want with a man like him? He had no home worth speaking of, no prospects beyond the odd jobs he took tracking for the army or guiding hunting parties. He'd fought in the war as a young man, then spent years scouting for the army in hostile territory. Such a life left marks on a man, not all of them visible, so he'd kept his distance, exchanging pleasantries when their paths crossed, but nothing more. Now he found himself wondering if he'd made a mistake. Life on the frontier was uncertain at best. People came and went, lived and died, and opportunities missed rarely presented themselves again. If when he rescued her from the Dalton gang, would things be different? Or would she simply return to her life in Bonanza, grateful for her rescue but uninterested in the solitary tracker who'd brought her home? Flynn pushed such thoughts aside. What mattered now was finding her, ensuring her safety. Everything else was secondary. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the red rocks of the canyon. Flynn remained vigilant, scanning the approach periodically with his spyglass. Finally, just past midday, he spotted them. 3 riders with a 4th in tow, approaching the canyon entrance at a steady pace. He trained the glass on them, confirming his targets. The leader rode in front, a large man with a black hat and a revolver holstered prominently on his hip. Behind him came the second outlaw, broader than the first, leading a horse on which Nora sat. The third man brought up the rear, constantly looking back the way they had come. Flynn focused on Nora. She sat straight in the saddle, her hands bound but her posture defiant. Her dress was dusty from travel, her copper hair partially fallen from its pins, but she appeared unharmed. The relief that flooded through him was so intense it momentarily took his breath away. Pushing aside emotion, Flynn calculated his approach. 1 against 3 were poor odds in a straight fight, but he had position and surprise on his side. If he could take out the leader first, the others might surrender rather than risk the same fate. It was a gamble, but Nora's life was worth the risk. He checked his rifle one last time, then settled in to wait for the perfect moment. Nora's body ached from hours in the saddle, and the ropes around her wrists had chafed her skin raw, despite Mac's marginal loosening of them the night before. But it was fear, not discomfort, that dominated her thoughts as they entered the imposing red walls of Rattlesnake Canyon. Something had changed in Vance's demeanor since morning. He was edgier, more alert, constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting trouble. When Jem had mentioned hearing something in the night, possibly a rider on their trail, Vance had cursed violently and pushed them to move faster. "No one could have followed us this far this quickly," Mac had argued. "We covered our tracks where it mattered." "Don't underestimate the trackers in these parts," Vance had retorted. "Especially not Dawson." The name had sent a jolt through Nora. Flynn Dawson. She knew him, or knew of him, at least. The former Army scout who lived in a cabin outside town, who occasionally stopped by the store for supplies but rarely engaged in conversation beyond what was necessary. A quiet man with observant eyes and a reputation for being able to track anything across any terrain. Was it possible her father had sent Dawson after them? Hope flared briefly in her chest before she tamped it down. Even if Dawson was pursuing them, he was 1 man against 3 armed outlaws. The odds were not in his favor. Still, as they rode deeper into the canyon, Nora found herself studying the towering walls above them, wondering if even now Flynn Dawson might be watching, planning her rescue. The canyon narrowed ahead, forcing them to ride single file. Vance led the way, followed by Nora on her horse, then Mac with Jem bringing up the rear. The walls rose almost vertically on either side, casting long shadows across the path despite the midday sun overhead. "I don't like this," Jem muttered. "Too easy to get trapped in here." "It's the fastest route south," Vance replied tersely. "We'll be through by nightfall." They had just entered the narrowest section when the crack of a rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls. Vance's horse reared as dirt kicked up inches from its hooves. The outlaw fought to control the animal as a voice called down from above. "That was a warning. The next one goes through your head, Vance." Nora's heart leaped at the sound of that voice. Flynn Dawson. He had found them. Vance drew his revolver, scanning the canyon walls frantically. "Show yourself, coward," Let the woman go and ride out the way you came, Flynn called. Do it now and you all live to see tomorrow. Jem was panicking, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. We're sitting ducks in here, Vance. Shut up, Vance snarled. His gaze locked on Nora, and in one fluid motion, he spurred his horse forward, grabbed her reins, and pulled her horse alongside his. Drawing a knife, he cut the rope binding her to the saddle horn and yanked her roughly across to his own mount. You want the woman, Dawson, he shouted, pressing the knife to Nora's throat. Come and get her. Otherwise, we're riding out of here together and she won't be coming back. The response was another rifle shot, this one striking the ground directly in front of Vance's horse. The animal shied violently, nearly unseating both riders. Vance cursed, struggling to maintain his hold on both Nora and his frightened mount. In that moment of distraction, Flynn made his move. Nora glimpsed movement from the canyon wall to their right, a figure sliding rapidly down a narrow crevice, rifle slung across his back. Before the outlaws could spot him, Flynn had dropped to the canyon floor and taken cover behind a large boulder. Last chance, Vance, Flynn called, his voice seeming to come from a different direction now. Let her go. Vance's grip on Nora tightened painfully. Not happening, Dawson. Either we all ride out together or the girl dies right here. What happened next unfolded with bewildering speed. A shot rang out from Flynn's position, striking Mac's horse in the flank. The animal screamed and bolted, throwing its rider hard against the canyon wall. Jem, in a panic, fired wildly in Flynn's direction, the bullets ricocheting harmlessly off rock. Vance, realizing his position was deteriorating rapidly, made a desperate decision. He shoved Nora roughly from his horse, sending her tumbling to the ground, and spurred his mount toward the southern exit of the narrow passage. Flynn emerged from cover, firing twice at the fleeing outlaw. The first shot missed. The second caught Vance in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around in the saddle. But he kept riding, disappearing around a bend in the canyon. Jem, seeing his leader flee, attempted to follow. Flynn's next shot struck the ground directly in front of his horse, causing the animal to rear in terror. Jem was thrown backward, landing hard on the rocky ground, his gun skittering away from his outstretched hand. Don't move, Flynn warned, his rifle trained steadily on the fallen outlaw. Nora struggled to her feet, her bound hands making it difficult to balance. Flynn glanced at her, concern evident in his eyes, but he kept his weapon trained on Jem. Are you hurt? He asked her. No, she managed, though her voice shook. Just bruised. Relief washed over his features briefly before his expression hardened again as he returned his attention to Jem. On your stomach, hands behind your head. The outlaw complied, trembling visibly. Flynn approached cautiously, quickly binding Jem's hands with a length of rope from his pack. Only then did he turn his full attention to Nora. Let me get those ropes off you, he said gently, drawing a knife from his belt. As he cut through her bindings, Nora studied his face. She'd seen Flynn Dawson in town many times before, but never this close. His eyes were a deep blue, set in a face weathered by years outdoors. A scar ran along his jawline, partially hidden by several days' growth of beard. He worked with careful precision, ensuring the knife came nowhere near her skin as he freed her. Thank you, she said as the ropes fell away. She rubbed her raw wrists, wincing at the pain. How did you find us? Followed your trail, he replied simply. Your father asked me to bring you home. What about them? Nora gestured toward Jem and the still unconscious Mac. We'll take them back to Bonanza to face justice. Flynn's gaze moved to the southern end of the passage. Vance is wounded. He won't get far. He's dangerous, Nora warned. Even wounded, Flynn nodded grimly. I know, but first, let's get you somewhere safe. There's a sheltered spot up the canyon where we can make camp for the night. I'll secure these two, then go after Vance. Alone? Nora couldn't keep the concern from her voice. Something flickered in Flynn's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her evident worry for his safety. I've handled worse odds, he assured her, but I need to know you're safe first. Within the hour, Flynn had bound both outlaws securely and confiscated their weapons. Mac had regained consciousness, cursing violently until Flynn had gagged him to silence his threats. After loading both men onto their horses, Flynn led the small party to a sheltered basin about half a mile up the canyon. A small spring provided fresh water, and the high walls offered protection from both the elements and prying eyes. Flynn secured the prisoners to a stunted pine tree, ensuring they could sit comfortably, but had no chance of escaping their bonds. I need to go after Vance before his trail gets cold, he told Nora as he checked his rifle. Will you be all right here? They can't get free, and no one knows this spot except a few Apache scouts I used to work with. Nora found herself reluctant to let him go. Flynn Dawson had come for her, tracked her across miles of wilderness, and faced 3 armed men alone to secure her freedom. The courage such actions required both impressed and humbled her. I'll be fine, she assured him, but please be careful. Vance isn't the type to surrender easily. Flynn held her gaze for a long moment. I'll be back by nightfall, he promised. Then, with a nod that seemed to contain words left unspoken, he mounted Copper and rode back toward the narrow passage of the canyon. Nora watched him go, a curious mix of emotions swirling within her. Relief at her rescue, certainly. Gratitude for Flynn's timely intervention. But something else too, a warmth that spread through her chest when he looked at her. A feeling she couldn't quite name, but found herself unwilling to ignore. Settling herself on a fallen log near the spring, well away from the secured outlaws, Nora allowed herself a moment to consider the man who had come for her. Flynn Dawson had always been something of a mystery in Bonanza. He kept to himself, lived simply, and rarely participated in town gatherings. Yet there was an integrity about him that people respected, a quiet competence that had apparently earned her father's trust enough to send him after her. And now, he was risking his life again to ensure her complete safety by pursuing Vance alone. The thought sent a chill through her, followed by a fierce hope that he would return unharmed. It was strange, she reflected, how circumstances could shift one's perspective so dramatically. Yesterday morning, Flynn Dawson had been merely a familiar face, a customer at her father's store. Today, he was her rescuer, a man whose courage and skill had saved her from a terrible fate. And tonight, when he returned as he must, as she would allow herself no other possibility, perhaps he would become something else entirely. Flynn followed Vance's trail with grim determination. The outlaw was losing blood, that much was clear from the dark droplets staining the rocky ground at intervals. But he was still moving at a decent pace, his horse's hoofprints showing he'd maintained a steady trot despite his injury. The trail led south through increasingly rugged terrain. Vance was avoiding the main path through the canyon, instead picking his way through smaller side passages and over rocky slopes. It was the route of a man who knew he was being pursued and was trying to lose his tracker. But Flynn hadn't spent years as an army scout for nothing. He read the signs with practiced ease, a displaced stone here, a broken twig there, the occasional smear of blood on a rock where Vance had brushed against it. The outlaw was heading toward the southern exit of Rattlesnake Canyon, likely aiming for the border beyond. By mid-afternoon, Flynn knew he was gaining ground. The blood spots were fresher, the tracks more recent. Vance's horse was tiring, its stride shortening, its path becoming less careful. The outlaw would need to rest soon, whether he wanted to or not. Sure enough, as Flynn rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, he spotted a horse tethered in the shadow of an overhanging rock. There was no sign of Vance, but the animal's heaving flanks and lathered neck told Flynn it had been ridden hard and recently. Flynn dismounted, drawing his rifle as he secured Copper to a scrubby bush. Moving cautiously from cover to cover, he scanned the surrounding area. Vance could be anywhere hiding behind rocks, possibly even doubling back behind him. A faint scuffing sound from above caught his attention. Flynn froze, then slowly raised his gaze to the ridge overlooking his position. There, partially concealed behind a boulder, was Vance. The outlaw had his revolver trained directly at Flynn. "Should have known you wouldn't give up easy, Dawson," Vance called down, his voice strained with pain. Always had a reputation for being stubborn. Flynn kept his rifle ready but didn't raise it yet. Any sudden movement would likely result in Vance firing. "It's over, Vance. Your men are captured. You're wounded and losing blood. Come in peacefully and you'll get a fair trial." Vance laughed harshly. "We both know how that trial ends, with me swinging from the end of a rope. I didn't shoot the sheriff just to surrender now." "Sheriff Carson's alive," Flynn replied steadily. "Wounded but alive. Murder's not on your charges yet." Something flickered across Vance's face: surprise, followed by calculation. "Kidnapping and robbery are enough to hang a man in these parts." "Depends on the judge," Flynn countered. "You haven't hurt Miss Jenkins. That counts for something." "Always the negotiator," Vance sneered. "That how you survived all those years in Apache territory? Talking your way out of trouble?" Flynn watched the outlaw carefully. Vance was pale, swaying slightly as he spoke. The wound in his shoulder was clearly taking its toll. "Sometimes talking's better than fighting," Flynn replied. "Especially when you're outnumbered or outgunned." "And which am I right now?" Vance asked, his revolver still trained on Flynn. "Neither," Flynn said honestly. "But you're bleeding out. In an hour, maybe less, you won't have the strength to pull that trigger. Then what?" Vance seemed to consider this, his gaze never leaving Flynn. "Where's the girl?" "Safe, away from here." "She's something, that one," Vance remarked, an unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Spirited, never begged once, never cried, just watched and waited, looking for her chance. Reminded me of a wildcat my pa caught once, all claws and fury no matter how tight the trap." Flynn felt a surge of anger at the comparison, but kept his expression neutral. "She's going home to her father. You're going back to Bonanza to face justice. Those are the only two endings to this story." Vance's smile faded. "There's a third ending, Dawson." His finger tightened on the trigger. "One where neither of us leaves this canyon." Flynn dove sideways as Vance fired, the bullet striking the rock where he'd been standing a moment before. Rolling behind a boulder, Flynn brought his rifle up and returned fire, aiming for the outcropping where Vance had been positioned. But the outlaw had moved, scrambling along the ridge to find new cover. Another shot rang out, this one striking uncomfortably close to Flynn's position. For several tense minutes, they exchanged fire, each man trying to get a clear shot at the other while staying protected. Flynn was conscious of his limited ammunition. He'd need to make each shot count if this standoff continued. Then, abruptly, the firing from Vance's position ceased. Flynn waited, listening intently, but heard nothing. Cautiously, he peered around his cover. The ridge where Vance had been was empty. Had the outlaw retreated? Or was this a trap designed to lure Flynn into the open? A faint sound from the direction of the tethered horses made Flynn's decision for him. Vance was attempting to escape. Moving quickly but carefully, Flynn worked his way back toward where he'd left Copper, using the terrain for cover. He arrived just in time to see Vance struggling to mount his exhausted horse. The outlaw's left arm hung uselessly at his side, blood darkening his shirt from shoulder to waist. He was using his remaining strength to haul himself into the saddle with one hand. Flynn stepped into the open, rifle raised. "It's over, Vance." The outlaw froze, then slowly turned to face Flynn. For a long moment they regarded each other in silence. Then Vance's hand moved toward the revolver holstered at his hip. "Don't," Flynn warned. Vance hesitated, his hand hovering near his weapon. His face, pale from blood loss, twisted into a grimace of defiance. "Never figured to die in chains," he said hoarsely. "Doesn't have to end that way," Flynn replied, though they both knew it was a lie. Vance seemed to consider this, then made his choice. His hand dropped to his revolver. Flynn fired once. The shot echoed off the canyon walls, startling a flock of ravens into flight from a nearby cliff. Vance remained upright for a moment, a look of surprise crossing his face. Then he crumpled to the ground beside his horse. Moving forward cautiously, rifle still ready, Flynn approached the fallen outlaw, but there was no need for caution anymore. Vance's eyes stared sightlessly at the sky, a red stain spreading across his chest. Flynn holstered his weapon and knelt beside the body. He hadn't wanted this ending, but Vance had made his choice. Now Flynn would have to bring the outlaw's body back to Bonanza, final proof that the danger was past, and Nora could return home safely. After securing Vance's body across his horse, Flynn mounted Copper and began the return journey to the basin, where he'd left Nora and the captured outlaws. The echo of the final gunshot seemed to linger in the canyon, a somber reminder of the thin line between life and death in this unforgiving land. Nora had heard the distant gunshots echoing through the canyon, each one sending a jolt of fear through her heart. One shot, then another, then silence. Then, after what seemed an eternity, a final shot that reverberated through the rocky walls before fading into silence once more. She paced the small basin anxiously, ignoring the sullen gazes of the bound outlaws. Had Flynn been successful? Was he wounded? Or worse? The sun was beginning to sink toward the western rim of the canyon when she heard the approach of horses. Nora positioned herself behind a large boulder, peering cautiously around its edge, ready to retreat deeper into the canyon if the arriving rider wasn't Flynn. Relief flooded through her as Flynn came into view, leading Vance's horse behind Copper. Her relief turned to grim understanding when she saw the body draped across the second horse's back. Flynn dismounted wearily, his face etched with fatigue. "It's done," he said simply. "Vance won't trouble anyone again." Nora approached him slowly. "Are you hurt?" Flynn shook his head. "Not a scratch. He was already weakened from the wound I gave him earlier." He glanced toward the secured outlaws. "Any trouble here?" "None," Nora assured him. "They've been quiet mostly." She hesitated, then added softly, "I'm glad you're safe." Something in her tone made Flynn look at her more closely. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world around them seemed to recede. There was understanding in that gaze, a recognition of something that had been forming between them even before the events of the past 2 days had thrown them together. The moment was broken by Mac calling out around his gag, demanding to know what had happened to Vance. Flynn turned away reluctantly, moving to check on the prisoners and ensure their bonds were still secure. "We'll camp here tonight," he told Nora as he returned. "It's too late to start back to Bonanza, and the horses need rest. We'll leave at first light tomorrow." Nora nodded, watching as Flynn efficiently set up their small camp. He built a fire, prepared a simple meal from his provisions, and arranged blankets for her to sleep on, all with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to life in the wilderness. As they sat beside the fire eating their supper, Nora found herself studying Flynn with new interest. In the flickering light, his features seemed both harder and more vulnerable than she'd previously realized. "You never told me how you found us so quickly," she said after they'd eaten in companionable silence for a while. Flynn set aside his plate. "I knew which direction they'd head south, toward the border, and I knew they'd likely take Rattlesnake Canyon as the fastest route through the mountains. So instead of following directly behind, I cut across the eastern hills to get ahead of you." "My father asked you specifically to come after me," Flynn nodded. "He did. Said I was the best tracker in the territory." A faint smile touched his lips. "He also offered a substantial reward, which I declined." Nora's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You declined? Why?" Flynn looked into the fire, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Some things aren't done for money." "Then why did you come after me?" Nora asked softly. Flynn's gaze lifted to meet hers. "Because it was you," he said simply. The honesty in those 4 words stole Nora's breath. She had suspected, perhaps even hoped, that Flynn Dawson might harbor some feeling for her beyond mere neighborly concern. Now, seeing the emotion in his eyes, she knew it was true. "I've noticed you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "In town, at the store, I always wondered why you never stayed to talk. What would a man like me have to say to a woman like you?" Flynn asked, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "I'm just a former scout with a cabin in the woods and not much else to my name. A man who tracked 3 armed outlaws across miles of wilderness alone," Nora countered. "A man who risked his life to save a woman he barely knew. I'd say such a man has quite a lot to recommend him." Flynn looked at her in wonder, as if seeing something he hadn't allowed himself to perceive before. "Nora, Miss Jenkins," Jem's panicked voice interrupted them. "Miss Jenkins, please, I need water." Flynn grimaced, the moment broken. "I'll deal with him," he said, rising to his feet. As he moved to attend to the prisoner, Nora remained by the fire, her thoughts in turmoil. She had always led a protected life in Bonanza, the cherished only child of a successful businessman. Men had shown interest in her before, of course, but none had ever affected her the way Flynn Dawson did, with his quiet strength and unassuming courage. The events of the past 2 days had changed her, she realized. Being kidnapped, fearing for her life, witnessing violence firsthand, these experiences had stripped away some of the sheltered naivety that had characterized her previous existence. And in its place was a newfound appreciation for the kind of man who could navigate this harsh world with integrity and compassion. A man like Flynn Dawson. When Flynn returned to the fire, Nora had made her decision. Whatever happened when they returned to Bonanza, she would not let this connection between them fade away unacknowledged. Life was too uncertain, too precious for such timidity. "Will you tell me about your time as a scout?" she asked as he settled beside her again. "I've heard stories, but I'd like to hear them from you." Flynn hesitated, then nodded slowly. As the night deepened around their small fire, he began to talk, sharing tales of his years with the army, of scouting parties and battles, of the Apache he'd come to respect, and the settlers he'd guided safely through hostile territory. Nora listened, entranced not just by the stories themselves but by the glimpses they provided into the man telling them. Flynn spoke matter-of-factly of danger and hardship, of courage and loss, painting a picture of a life lived on the knife's edge of survival. "After the last campaign," he concluded, "I'd had enough of fighting. Took my discharge and headed north. Found Bonanza by accident, really. Stopped for supplies and liked the look of the valley. Bought that piece of land east of town with my army pay and built the cabin. Been there 2 years now." "Do you ever get lonely?" Nora asked. "Living out there by yourself?" Flynn's gaze met hers across the fire. Sometimes, he admitted, but I've gotten used to my own company over the years. Perhaps you shouldn't have to be so used to it, Nora suggested quietly. A log shifted in the fire, sending a shower of sparks upward into the night sky. Flynn watched them rise and fade before responding. "When we get back to Bonanza," he said carefully, "things will return to normal. You to your father's house, me to my cabin. That's the way it should be." "Is it?" Nora challenged gently. "Or is that just what you've convinced yourself is inevitable?" Flynn looked at her in surprise, clearly not expecting such directness. "Nora, you're Thomas Jenkins's daughter. You've had schooling back east. You could have your pick of proper gentlemen with prospects and futures. Why would you even consider—" "A man who saved my life," she interrupted. "A man of integrity and courage. A man who treats me as an equal rather than a fragile ornament to be protected and pampered." Nora shook her head. "I may be Thomas Jenkins's daughter, but I'm also my own woman. And I decide for myself what and who is worthy of consideration." Flynn seemed momentarily speechless. Finally, he said, "You've been through a frightening ordeal. It's natural to feel gratitude towards someone who helped you." "But this isn't gratitude," Nora said firmly. "This is recognition. Of you, Flynn Dawson. Of who you are and what you mean to me, something I perhaps didn't fully understand until these past 2 days showed me with perfect clarity." Flynn stared at her for a long moment, his expression a mix of disbelief and dawning hope. Then, with a deliberateness that made Nora's heart quicken, he moved around the fire to sit beside her. "I've watched you from afar for 2 years, he confessed, his voice low. "Admired you. Wondered about you. But I never imagined you'd look twice at a man like me." "Then you haven't been paying close enough attention," Nora replied with a small smile. Flynn reached out hesitantly, his calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of copper hair from her face. The touch sent a shiver through Nora that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "When we return to Bonanza," Flynn said softly, "may I call on you properly? With your father's permission?" "Yes," Nora whispered. "I'd like that very much." Their gazes held, and in that moment, something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that neither had dared to voice before. Then, with a restraint that spoke volumes about his character, Flynn withdrew his hand and moved back to his side of the fire. "We should get some rest," he said. "It's a long ride back to town tomorrow." Nora nodded, understanding the propriety of his withdrawal even as a part of her wished he had stayed beside her. "Good night, Flynn." "Good night, Nora," he replied, and the way he said her name like something precious and rare warmed her more than any fire could. The journey back to Bonanza took 2 full days. Flynn led their small party, Nora riding her own horse, the 2 captured outlaws bound and mounted on theirs, and Vance's body secured across his animal. They traveled cautiously, Flynn constantly alert for any sign of danger. But the dangers they encountered were merely the natural challenges of the terrain. A swollen stream that required careful fording, a rockfall that blocked their path and forced a detour, the scorching heat of midday that necessitated frequent stops in whatever shade they could find. Throughout it all, something new and fragile was growing between Flynn and Nora. Glances that lingered a moment longer than necessary. Conversations that ranged from the practical concerns of their journey to deeper discussions of books they'd read, places they'd been, dreams they harbored. Small gestures of consideration, Flynn ensuring Nora had the most comfortable spot during their overnight camp. Nora insisting on sharing the cooking duties, despite her limited experience with campfire cuisine. By the time they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley where Bonanza nestled beside its creek, they had formed a bond that transcended their previous casual acquaintance. Whether that bond would survive their return to civilization remained to be seen. As they rode down the main street of Bonanza late in the afternoon of the second day, townspeople emerged from stores and houses to witness their arrival. Word of Nora's kidnapping had spread, and her safe return caused a stir of excitement and relief. Sheriff Carson, his arm in a sling but otherwise recovered from his wound, met them outside the jail. Deputies quickly took charge of the prisoners, leading them inside to the cells that would hold them until the circuit judge arrived. "You did it, Dawson," Carson acknowledged gruffly, eyeing Vance's body. "Brought them all to justice one way or another." Flynn nodded, dismounting wearily. "They'll stand trial for kidnapping and attempted murder. Should be enough to put them away for a good long while." "And my father?" Nora asked anxiously. "Is he all right?" "At the store, Miss Jenkins," Carson replied. "Doc Wilson patched him up proper. He's been worried sick about you." Flynn helped Nora down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I'll take you to him," he said quietly. As they walked the short distance to Jenkins' general store, Nora was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. Some called out greetings or expressions of relief at her safe return. Others simply watched, no doubt already formulating the gossip that would circulate about her ordeal and rescue. The store was closed, its blinds drawn despite the business hours posted on the door. Flynn knocked firmly, and almost immediately they heard hurried footsteps from within. The door flew open to reveal Thomas Jenkins, his face haggard with worry, his injured arm supported by a sling similar to the sheriff's. When he saw Nora standing there, alive and relatively unharmed, the transformation in his expression was profound. "Nora!" he cried, pulling her into a fierce one-armed embrace. Thank God you're safe." Nora returned his embrace, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm all right, Pa. Mr. Dawson found me in time." Thomas looked over his daughter's head at Flynn, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You brought her back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just as you promised." Flynn nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. "She's safe now. The outlaws who took her are either dead or in custody." Thomas released Nora and extended his hand to Flynn. "I can never repay what you've done, but the reward stands. $5,000 as promised." Flynn hesitated, then shook the older man's hand firmly. "Keep your money, Mr. Jenkins. I didn't do this for a reward." Thomas regarded him thoughtfully. "No, I don't suppose you did." His gaze moved between Flynn and Nora, noting something in their manner toward each other that hadn't been there before. "Well, you must at least come in for a meal. Both of you look like you could use a hot dinner and a comfortable chair." The next few hours passed in a blur of food, conversation, and repeated tellings of their ordeal. Thomas insisted on hearing every detail, his expression darkening at the descriptions of Vance's threats and the danger Flynn had faced in the confrontation at Rattlesnake Canyon. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared away, Thomas leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "It seems I owe you more than money could ever repay, Dawson. You risked your life to save my daughter." Flynn, who had been quiet for much of the meal, met the older man's gaze steadily. "Mr. Jenkins, there's something I need to ask you." Thomas raised an eyebrow, waiting. Flynn glanced at Nora, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I would like your permission to call on your daughter." A moment of silence followed this request. Thomas looked from Flynn to Nora, taking in his daughter's expectant expression. "I see," he said finally. "And is this something you want, Nora?" "Yes, Pa," she replied without hesitation. "Very much." Thomas studied Flynn with new intensity. "You're not a wealthy man, Dawson. Your cabin is small, your income uncertain. My daughter has been raised with certain comforts. I'm aware of that, Flynn acknowledged. I can't offer her luxury, but I can promise to work hard, to provide for her needs, and to protect her with my life if necessary, as I've already demonstrated. A hint of a smile touched Thomas's lips. Yes, you have at that, he turned to Nora. And you're certain about this. It would be a very different life from what you've known. I've never been more certain of anything, Nora replied firmly. These past few days have shown me what truly matters, Pa. And what matters to me is being with a man I can respect and admire, a man of courage and integrity. Thomas considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. You have my permission to court my daughter, Dawson. But I warn you, if your intentions aren't honorable, or if you cause her any unhappiness, no amount of tracking skill will help you escape my wrath. Understood, sir, Flynn replied seriously. And my intentions are entirely honorable. Good. Thomas rose from his chair with a grimace, his wounded shoulder clearly paining him. Now it's been a long day, and I expect you both could use some rest. Dawson, you're welcome to stay in our guest room tonight rather than riding back to your cabin. Flynn nodded gratefully. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. After Thomas had retired to his room, Flynn and Nora found themselves alone in the parlor. The lamps had been turned low, casting a warm glow over the comfortable furnishings so different from the firelit canyon where they had shared their first real conversation. Your father is a good man, Flynn observed quietly. He wants what's best for you, and he's beginning to see that what's best for me might not be what he originally envisioned, Nora replied with a small smile. Though I suspect it will take some time for him to fully accept the idea of his daughter living in a cabin in the woods. Flynn's expression grew serious. Nora, I need you to be certain. Your father's right life with me would be very different from what you're accustomed to. Simpler. Harder in many ways. Nora moved to sit beside him on the settee. Do you think me so shallow that I value comfort above character, so fragile that I couldn't adapt to a different way of living? No, Flynn said quickly. I think you're one of the strongest women I've ever met. But I also think you haven't had much chance to see how rough life can be outside of town. Then teach me, Nora challenged gently. Show me your world, Flynn Dawson. I'm a quick study, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Flynn's hand found hers, his calloused fingers entwining with her smoother ones. You truly mean it, don't you? I do, she affirmed. These past days have changed me, Flynn. Being kidnapped, fearing for my life, it makes you see with perfect clarity what truly matters. And what matters to me is being with someone who sees me as I am, not as some delicate flower to be protected from every hardship. Flynn squeezed her hand gently. I see you, Nora Jenkins. I've been seeing you for 2 years, even when I tried to convince myself it was hopeless to do so. It was never hopeless, she whispered. I just needed you to step out of the shadows and show me who you really are. Flynn raised their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. It was a gesture of promise, of possibility, of a future neither had dared to imagine before the events of the past few days had thrown them together. I should let you rest, he said reluctantly. It's been a long journey. Nora nodded, equally reluctant to end their time together, but aware of the propriety expected under her father's roof. Good night, Flynn. Good night, Nora, he replied softly, releasing her hand with evident reluctance. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Nora felt a profound sense of homecoming, not just to the familiar surroundings of her father's house, but to a new understanding of herself and what she wanted from life. The ordeal of her kidnapping had been terrifying, but from that, terror had emerged a clarity she might never have found otherwise. And in Flynn Dawson, she had discovered not just a rescuer, but a man who saw her strength as well as her vulnerability, who valued her mind as well as her beauty. A man worth building a future with, however different that future might be from the one she had previously envisioned. The months that followed transformed both their lives in ways neither could have fully anticipated. Flynn courted Nora with a quiet devotion that soon became the talk of Bonanza. They were seen riding together in the hills surrounding the town, Nora's copper hair gleaming in the sunlight as Flynn pointed out the hidden trails and secret valleys he had discovered during his solitary explorations. They attended church services side by side, Flynn initially uncomfortable in his best shirt and polished boots, but gradually relaxing, as he was accepted into the community, not just as the man who had rescued Thomas Jenkins's daughter, but as a valuable citizen in his own right. Flynn began taking more regular work, using his tracking skills to help ranchers locate lost cattle, to assist the sheriff with particularly challenging cases, and occasionally to guide hunting parties from back east who came seeking trophies in the Colorado wilderness. The income wasn't substantial, but it was steadier than before, and it allowed him to begin making improvements to his cabin. Nora, meanwhile, continued to help her father at the store while also spending time at Flynn's cabin, learning the skills she would need for life beyond the comforts of town. Under Flynn's patient guidance, she learned to build and maintain a fire in all weather conditions, to identify edible plants in the forest, to shoot with reasonable accuracy, and to read the signs of approaching storms in the sky. Thomas Jenkins watched these developments with a mixture of concern and grudging approval. He had hoped for a different sort of match for his only daughter, perhaps the son of a successful businessman or a promising young lawyer from Denver. But as he observed the way Nora blossomed in Flynn's company, the way her eyes lit up whenever he entered a room, Thomas found his reservations gradually giving way to acceptance. In late autumn, with the aspen trees turning gold on the mountainsides and the first hint of winter's chill in the morning air, Flynn invited Thomas to his cabin for a private conversation. The improvements Flynn had made over the past months were immediately apparent. The cabin had been expanded by a third, with a new bedroom added to the original structure. The roof had been completely reshingled, the windows fitted with proper glass panes, and a covered porch added across the front. Inside, the furnishings were still simple but of good quality, with a new cook stove gleaming in the kitchen area and comfortable chairs drawn up before the stone fireplace. "You've been busy," Thomas observed, accepting a cup of coffee as they sat before the fire. Flynn nodded. "I wanted to make this place worthy of Nora if she chooses to share it with me." Thomas sipped his coffee, recognizing the opening for what it was. "And is that what you're asking me today? My blessing for you to make that offer to my daughter?" "It is," Flynn confirmed, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. "I love Nora, Mr. Jenkins. I want to make her my wife to build a life with her. I may never be wealthy, but I swear to you that she'll never want for anything essential and she'll never doubt my devotion to her happiness." Thomas set his cup aside, his expression thoughtful. "When you first asked permission to court Nora, I had my doubts. I won't deny it. You seemed too different from the life she'd known, too solitary, perhaps too marked by your years on the frontier." Flynn nodded, accepting this assessment without offense. "But these past months," Thomas continued, "I've watched you with my daughter. I've seen how you listen to her, how you respect her intelligence and her opinions. I've seen how you've worked to improve your circumstances not just for yourself, but for the future you hope to share with her." He paused, his gaze moving around the cabin that bore so many signs of careful preparation for a shared life. "Most importantly, I've seen how happy Nora is with you." Happier than I've seen her since her mother passed, if I'm being honest." Flynn waited, hardly daring to hope for the words that followed. "You have my blessing, Dawson," Thomas said finally. "And more than that, you have my gratitude not just for saving her life all those months ago, but for bringing such joy into it since then." Flynn's relief and gratitude were evident in the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his normally guarded expression opened into a smile of genuine happiness. "Thank you, sir. I promise you won't have cause to regret your decision." "See that I don't," Thomas replied, but the words held no real warning, only the natural concern of a father preparing to entrust his most precious treasure to another's keeping. 2 weeks later, on a crisp November afternoon with the mountains etched sharp and clear against the blue Colorado sky, Flynn took Nora riding to a promontory overlooking the valley, where Bonanza nestled like a toy town beside its winding creek. They dismounted, and Flynn spread a blanket on a flat rock warmed by the autumn sun. From his saddlebag, he produced a small picnic-fresh bread, cheese, sliced apples, and a bottle of wine he'd purchased specially from the hotel for this occasion. As they ate and talked, watching golden eagles soaring on the thermals above the valley, Nora was struck by how far they'd come since that terrifying day when she'd been taken from her father's store. The man beside her now was still the same Flynn Dawson who had tracked her across miles of wilderness and faced down 3 armed outlaws to bring her home, but he was also so much more. He was the man who read poetry by lamplight, who knew the names of every star in the night sky, who listened to her dreams and shared his own. The man whose rare smile transformed his weather-worn face into something unexpectedly beautiful. The man whose touch, always gentle, always respectful, nevertheless sent warmth coursing through her whenever their hands met. "There's something I want to show you," Flynn said when they had finished eating. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. Nora watched curiously as he untied the drawstring and tipped the contents into his palm. A ring gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, a simple band of gold with a small, perfect diamond at its center. "It was my mother's," Flynn explained, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. "One of the few things I have left from her. My father gave it to her when they were homesteading in Nebraska before they moved west to Colorado." Nora's heart began to race as she realized the significance of what was happening. "Flynn, I had it polished and the stone reset," he continued. "I wanted it to be perfect because that's what you deserve, Nora. Perfection. And I know I'm not perfect, far from it. I'm just a man who's seen too much of the rough side of life, who's lived too long alone, who probably doesn't deserve someone like you." "Flynn," Nora interrupted gently, "that's not true." He met her gaze, his blue eyes serious. "What I can promise you is this. If you'll have me as your husband, I'll spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you. I'll work hard to provide for you and for any children we might be blessed with. I'll respect your mind and your spirit, and I'll never try to cage either. I'll be faithful and true to you until the day I die." Flynn took a deep breath, then asked the question he'd been preparing for since the moment he'd first seen her in the hands of her kidnappers, and known he would do anything to bring her safely home. "Nora Jenkins, will you marry me?" Tears welled in Nora's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Flynn Dawson, I will marry you." Flynn's hands trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. Then he gathered her gently into his arms, and their lips met in a kiss that was both a culmination and a beginning, the first of many they would share in the years to come. The wedding took place on Christmas Eve in the small church in Bonanza, its interior transformed by pine boughs, red ribbons, and dozens of candles that cast a warm glow over the assembled guests. Nearly everyone in town had turned out for the occasion, curious to witness the union of Thomas Jenkins's daughter and the solitary tracker, whose heroic rescue had evolved into a courtship few had anticipated, but many had come to support. Nora wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her taller frame. The ivory satin gleamed in the candlelight as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her copper hair arranged in an intricate knot adorned with small white flowers. Flynn waited at the altar in a new black suit, his usually untamed hair neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. The expression in his eyes as he watched Nora approach was one of such naked adoration that several of the older women in the congregation discreetly wiped away tears. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and unwavering as they promised to love, honor, and cherish each other for all the days of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Flynn kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied his reputation as a hardened frontiersman. The celebration afterward, held in the town hall decorated with evergreen boughs and red berries, lasted well into the night. There was music from a local fiddler, dancing, a feast prepared by the women of the community, and enough goodwill to warm even the coldest winter night. As midnight approached, Flynn and Nora slipped away from the festivities and rode through the crisp, star-filled night to the cabin that would now be their shared home. Flynn had forbidden Nora from visiting during the 2 weeks leading up to the wedding, wanting to surprise her with the final touches he had added. When they arrived, Flynn insisted on carrying Nora across the threshold in the traditional manner, setting her gently on her feet in the main room of the cabin. What Nora saw left her momentarily speechless. The interior had been transformed. New curtains hung at the windows, made from fabric she recognized from the store. A colorful quilt adorned the bed visible through the open door to the bedroom. The wooden table gleamed with polish, set with 2-place settings of surprisingly delicate china. A small Christmas tree stood in one corner, decorated with paper stars and topped with a carved wooden angel. But it was the bookshelf that brought tears to Nora's eyes. Built into the wall beside the fireplace, it held all the books she had mentioned loving during their courtship: poetry by Tennyson and Browning, novels by Austen and the Brontes, volumes of history and natural philosophy that reflected her wide-ranging interests. "Flynn," she breathed, moving to touch the spines of the books reverently. "How did you?" "Your father helped," Flynn admitted. "He ordered them specially from Denver, said every home needed a library and every wife deserved to have her favorite books around her." Nora turned to her husband, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain all she felt. "It's perfect, all of it." Flynn crossed the room to stand before her, his hands gently cradling her face. "You're perfect," he corrected softly, "and I still can't quite believe you're mine." "I am yours," Nora affirmed, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "As you are mine, now and always." Their kiss deepened, no longer constrained by the propriety that had governed their courtship. They were husband and wife now, free to express the passion that had simmered beneath the surface of their relationship since those fateful days in Rattlesnake Canyon. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, the moon casting silver light through the window onto the quilt that covered them, Nora rested her head on Flynn's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy?" Flynn asked softly, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. "Completely," Nora assured him. "Are you?" Flynn's arms tightened around her. "More than I ever thought possible," he confessed. "For so long, I believed happiness wasn't meant for men like me, men who'd seen too much darkness, done too many hard things to survive. But you changed that, Nora. You made me believe in the possibility of joy again." Nora lifted her head to look at him, her copper hair spilling across his chest. "That darkness is part of who you are, Flynn. I wouldn't change it even if I could, because it shaped the man I love." Flynn touched her cheek wonderingly. "How did I find you?" "As I recall," Nora replied with a small smile, "you tracked me across miles of wilderness after I was kidnapped by outlaws." Flynn laughed softly, the sound rumbling pleasantly beneath her ear as she settled her head back on his chest. "So I did. Best tracking I ever did, without question." As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Nora thought of the journey that had brought them here, a journey that began in terror, but had culminated in this profound joy. From the moment of her kidnapping to this moment of perfect contentment, stretched a path neither of them could have foreseen, but both now recognized as inevitable. The outlaws who had taken her, believing they acted for selfish gain, had unwittingly set in motion events that would bring together two souls destined for each other. It was a strange twist of fate, but one for which Nora found herself profoundly grateful as she fell asleep in the arms of the man who had risked everything to bring her home. Spring came to the Colorado highlands with a burst of wildflowers across the meadows and new leaves unfurling on the aspen trees. The cabin that Flynn and Nora now shared had continued to evolve during the winter months, becoming a true home that reflected both their personalities. Flynn had added a small conservatory to the southern side, a sun-filled space where Nora could nurture the plants she loved even when snow blanketed the ground outside. Nora had turned the main room into a warm, inviting space with comfortable furnishings, colorful rugs, and artwork she'd acquired from passing traders. Their life together had found its rhythm. Flynn still worked as a tracker and guide, sometimes for days at a stretch, but he always returned to find Nora waiting, often with new improvements to their home or exciting news from town to share. Nora divided her time between helping her father at the store 3 days a week and maintaining their household, while also finding time to teach reading and writing to several of the miners' children who had little formal education. They complemented each other perfectly, Flynn's quiet strength balancing Nora's more outgoing nature, her social connections in town offsetting his tendency toward solitude, his practical skills matching her more abstract knowledge. Together, they had created a marriage that was both passionate and comfortable, exciting and secure. On a particular morning in late May, Nora stood at the stove in their kitchen, preparing breakfast as sunlight streamed through the windows. Flynn had been away for 3 days, guiding a geologist from the university in Denver who was studying the mineral deposits in the mountains west of Bonanza. She heard the familiar sound of Copper's hoofbeats approaching, and her heart lifted as it always did at the prospect of Flynn's return. Setting aside the spoon she'd been using to stir the oatmeal, Nora wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the door. Flynn was dismounting as she stepped onto the porch, his face lighting with a smile that was reserved solely for her. "Good morning, Mrs. Dawson," he called, securing Copper to the hitching post before striding toward her. "Welcome home, Mr. Dawson," she replied, stepping into his embrace without hesitation. Flynn's arms tightened around her, his face buried in her hair as if drawing strength from her presence. When he finally released her, Nora studied his face, noting the fatigue in his eyes but also the contentment that always seemed to accompany his return home. "You're just in time for breakfast," she said, leading him inside. "And I have news that couldn't wait for a letter." Flynn raised an eyebrow as he removed his hat and coat, hanging them on the pegs by the door. Good news, I hope, Nora nodded, a smile playing at her lips as she returned to the stove. The circuit judge arrived yesterday. Mac and Jem's trial is set for next week. Pa says with the evidence against them and the witnesses ready to testify, there's no doubt they'll be convicted. That is good news, Flynn agreed, pouring water into the basin to wash away the dust of the trail. It'll bring proper closure to what happened, especially for your father. Nora stirred the oatmeal, adding a handful of dried berries to the pot. There's more, she said, her tone shifting to something softer, more intimate. News of a more personal nature. Flynn looked up from drying his hands, alerted by the change in her voice. What is it, Nora? She turned to face him fully, one hand resting lightly on her stomach. Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Flynn, in early December, he thinks. Flynn went absolutely still, the towel forgotten in his hands. A baby, he repeated, his voice barely audible. You're certain? Nora nodded, suddenly nervous at his stunned reaction. Quite certain. Dr. Wilson says everything appears normal and healthy. Are you pleased? The question seemed to break through Flynn's shock. In 2 strides, he crossed the kitchen and gathered her carefully into his arms, as if she had suddenly become infinitely more precious and fragile. Pleased, he echoed, his voice thick with emotion. Nora, I don't have words for what I'm feeling. He drew back slightly to look into her face, and Nora was startled to see tears in his eyes. A child, he said wonderingly. Our child. A new life we've created together. The joy in his expression erased any doubt Nora might have harbored about his reaction. I've been so eager for you to come home so I could tell you, she confessed. I've been keeping the secret for 3 days, and it's been nearly impossible. Flynn laughed, a sound of pure delight that Nora didn't hear from him nearly often enough. Then he kissed her with such tenderness it brought tears to her own eyes. I love you, he said when they parted. I've never said those words enough, but I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. And now, his hand came to rest gently over hers on her stomach. Now you're giving me a family, something I never dared to hope for. The breakfast nearly burned as they stood together in the morning sunlight, lost in the wonder of the future that was unfolding before them. A future neither could have imagined on that fateful day when Outlaws had torn Nora from her father's store and Flynn had set out alone to bring her home. In the years that followed, the cabin in the woods became a true homestead. Flynn added 2 more rooms as their family grew, first with the birth of their son, Thomas Flynn Dawson, in December of 1878, and then their daughter, Marie Elizabeth Dawson, in the spring of 1881. The land surrounding the cabin was gradually transformed as well. Flynn cleared space for a larger garden, built a proper stable for their horses, and constructed a workshop where he crafted furniture during the winter months when tracking work was scarce. Nora planted an orchard of apple and cherry trees, established beehives that produced honey for their table and for sale in town, and created flower beds that bloomed from early spring until the first frosts of autumn. Their children grew strong and healthy in the clean mountain air, learning both Flynn's wilderness skills and Nora's love of books and ideas. Young Thomas showed his father's talent for tracking and his mother's quick intelligence, while Marie inherited Nora's copper hair and Flynn's quiet determination. Flynn's reputation as the best tracker in the territory only grew with time. He was sought out by the army for special assignments, by wealthy Easterners for hunting expeditions, and by the territorial governor himself when particularly challenging situations arose. But no matter how far his work took him, he always returned to the home and family that had become the center of his world. Nora, too, found fulfillment beyond what she had initially imagined. When her father decided to retire in 1883, he sold the store to Nora and Flynn rather than to an outside buyer. Under their joint management, Jenkins and Dawson General Store became not just a place to purchase supplies but a community gathering spot where news was shared, problems discussed, and solutions found. Thomas Jenkins moved into a comfortable house next to the store, where he delighted in spoiling his grandchildren and offering occasionally solicited advice on business matters. The wound he had received during Nora's kidnapping had left him with a permanent stiffness in his shoulder, but otherwise, he enjoyed good health and remained an active part of Bonanza's community. The town itself prospered and grew as new silver strikes in the surrounding mountains brought fresh waves of miners and settlers. By 1885, Bonanza boasted a proper school, a second church, a newspaper, and even a small theater where traveling shows occasionally performed. Through all these changes, the bond between Flynn and Nora only strengthened. The passion that had drawn them together in the aftermath of her kidnapping matured into a deep, abiding love that weathered the inevitable challenges of life on the frontier: harsh winters, occasional illnesses, financial uncertainties, and the constant hard work required to thrive in such an environment. There were difficult times, of course. The winter of 1883 brought record snowfalls that isolated their cabin for weeks. The economic downturn of 1884 affected business at the store and reduced demand for Flynn's tracking services. Marie's bout with scarlet fever in 1885 frightened them both terribly before she recovered fully under Dr. Wilson's care. But there were far more moments of joy than sorrow. Summer picnics in mountain meadows carpeted with wildflowers. Christmas celebrations with family and friends gathered around their table. The simple pleasure of sitting together on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson while their children played in the yard. In the autumn of 1888, nearly 10 years after the kidnapping that had brought them together, Flynn and Nora stood on the same promontory where he had proposed to her. Their children were spending the day with their grandfather in town, giving the couple a rare opportunity for solitude. "Do you ever think about it?" Nora asked as they gazed out over the valley, now dotted with many more buildings than had existed a decade earlier. "About what might have happened if I hadn't been taken that day." Flynn's arm tightened around her waist. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I might never have found the courage to approach you properly, might have gone on watching you from a distance, convincing myself you were beyond my reach." Nora leaned her head against his shoulder. At 32, she was still as beautiful as she had been at 22, though motherhood and the challenges of frontier life had added character to her face and a few strands of silver to her copper hair. "I think about how much I might have missed," she said softly. "This life with you, our children, this home we've built together, it's more than I ever dreamed possible." Flynn turned to face her fully, his hands gentle on her shoulders. At 37, he remained as strong and capable as ever, though the years had etched a few more lines around his eyes and added gray to his temples. "Out of something terrible came the greatest blessing of my life," he said. "Finding you, loving you, building this family with you, it's been worth every hardship, every struggle." "And there have been a few," Nora acknowledged with a small smile. "There have," Flynn agreed. "But I wouldn't change a moment of it, because every step we've taken, together or apart, has led us here. To this life we share." As the autumn sun cast long shadows across the valley, and the first evening star appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky, Flynn and Nora Dawson stood together on the mountainside, bound by a love that had begun in danger and courage, but had flourished in the quiet moments of everyday life. a love that had transformed them both, giving Flynn a home and family he had never thought to claim, giving Nora a partnership that challenged and fulfilled her in ways she had never anticipated. Far below, the lights of Bonanza began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Soon they would need to ride down to collect their children and return to their cabin in the woods. There would be supper to prepare, stories to read, plans to make for the coming winter. The ordinary rituals of a life extraordinary only in the depth of love that sustained it. "We should head back," Flynn said eventually, though he made no move to release her. "In a moment," Nora replied, raising her face for his kiss. "Just a moment more." And as their lips met in the fading light, both silently acknowledged the truth they had discovered through years of joy and hardship. That real love, was not found in grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but in the choice to face each day together, to build something lasting from whatever life presented, and to see in each other not just who they were, but who they might become. It was a lesson born in the terror of kidnapping and the courage of rescue, but proven in the 1,000 ordinary days that followed, days that, strung together like pearls on a thread, created a life more precious than either could have imagined on that long-ago morning when Outlaws rode into Bonanza and changed their destinies forever.